Thank you very much indeed, and a big warm welcome back to day 2 of the 2024 NPCC APCC Summit in collaboration with the College of Policing. I understand it was a really great night last night and fascinating to listen to Jonathan Van Tam, who clearly touched a lot of people with his commentary about his experiences and how it's impacted him going forward. So it sounds as though an amazing speaker to listen to, and I suspect possibly a little later on, a late night for some. So it's great to see everybody back in the room this morning. After a busy day yesterday, we've got a packed schedule this morning, kicking off with the keynote speech by the new Shadow Home Secretary. We'll also be discussing the wider issues beyond policing with the criminal justice system, discussing race equality in policing, a whole range of those lightning talks, timed 4 minutes from across policing and PCCs across the country. And the thing I'm looking forward to most, I have to say, is we've got the most amazing youth advisory board to the Youth Endowment Fund joining us before lunch. Their incredible work, and they are the most dedicated team of young people trying to engage young people in communities to discern what young people need from policing and how policing can best engage with them. So given that we're looking towards the horizon and futures, I think they will be some of the most powerful voices in the summit. You can see all of those biogs on the summit app, as well as details of the breakout rooms for the sessions, different sessions we're holding this morning. And just before we get going, we're going to run the safety announcement from the centre again, so I think they've got it queued up.
Welcome to the QE2 Centre. Please take a moment to listen to the following safety message. There is no planned fire drill taking place today. In the event of an alarm, please leave the building immediately via your nearest fire exit. Further instructions will be given at the time. Please make your event organiser aware if you require assistance. Once outside, you should disperse away from the building and await further information from your event organiser. Thank you for listening and enjoy your event.
So that's the health and safety message again this morning. One of the things that worked really well is just the number of questions that I got on the Slido format via your Summit app. So please keep those coming, because it really gives me a sense of what you're particularly interested in, and I'm here on your behalf to get the questions put to the panels and the speakers. So keep those questions coming, and I will, of course, try to keep as good an eye as possible around the room if you want to ask that question in person. So given that we've got a keynote speech coming, really keen to hear what questions you'd like for the Shadow Home Secretary. Thanks to everybody who completed the survey on the app last night. Please do so again this evening, because it really helps the organisers who will already be thinking about next year's event. And a big plea from the amazing exhibitors that we have joining us in the Pickwick space to go and visit them and say hello. Plenty of time during coffee or lunch, which we're hoping that you will all stay for as well. There are a lot of people that would really enjoy meeting and speaking to you, so I just urge you to go and say hello to them. So to kick off today, I'm really delighted to introduce PCC Katie Bourne, APCC Conservative Lead, to introduce the keynote speaker this morning. Katie, hi.
Thank you, Julie. Good morning, everybody. Oh, bleary night last night. Welcome back, and good to see you all here, looking bright and shiny, if I may say. So the next speaker probably doesn't need much introduction, but you're going to get one from me anyway. He is the MP for Croydon South, where he's been the MP for over 10 years now. He was a minister in the Home Office for 4 years, and 2 of those as policing minister, where he gained very quickly a reputation for doing the detail. In fact, I remember within days of him being appointed as policing minister, he was on the phone to many PCCs, and it was very, very quick, where he got well over his brief. It didn't take long, and we were thrilled for that. He definitely has a passion for this role and policing, and he brings a real energy to the role as well. Many of you will know he has had a particular focus on technology, and even the Home Secretary yesterday recognised his passion for focus on technology, particularly facial recognition. And of course, we spent most of yesterday talking a lot about technology in policing and how it's going to change things. So I think for me, the real point of interest, though, are his socks. And I'm absolutely delighted to say today he has not disappointed. So have a look at those as well. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please put your hands together to welcome my colleague and my friend, the Shadow Home Secretary, the Right Honourable Chris Philp.
Good morning. Well, Katie, thank you for that introduction. I feel I should start by just confirming that I am, as usual, wearing Union Jack socks, which, when I was sitting on the government front bench in government, used to really wind up the Scottish Nationalist Party, who frequently commented on them. I'm very sorry I couldn't join your dinner last night. I hope the hangovers are not proving too oppressive this morning. Thank you for the warm welcome again. Great to see so many friendly and familiar faces here this morning. And as Katie said, I'm really delighted to be re-entering the policing world after a gap of just 4 months. I've certainly missed you all. I hope you've missed me too. We will, thank you, Katie. We will find out in due course. My time as policing minister in the Home Office, I think, were among the best years I spent in government. Now, I know that did include a spell as Liz Truss's Chief Secretary to the Treasury, so the bar is not hugely high. But those years as police minister were definitely the best I spent in government. And so I'm looking forward enormously to my new role as Shadow Home Secretary. And I certainly intend to work constructively with policing leaders, with police and crime commissioners, and indeed the government in the national interest. And in fact, when Diana Johnson was appointed as my successor as police minister, I made a point of spending some time with her, sort of handing over some of the projects that I'd been working on, including live facial recognition. I understand most ministers, most outgoing ministers, don't do that, but I was keen to make sure she had the best possible chance to make a success of the role, because it is in our national interest to do that, regardless of which political party is in government. But of course, as you would expect, and as my constitutional role requires, I will also hold the government robustly to account if they fall short or, heaven forbid, fail to keep any promises which they may have made. Now, I know there have been some serious challenges in the last year for policing. Difficult protests and riots on our streets. The unrelenting glare of media scrutiny and often ill-informed social media commentary. We have seen some horrific murders, and we've seen vile hatred expressed towards some of our communities. And of course, violence against women and girls remains at unacceptable levels. But the challenges of our times are exactly why what policing does is so important. Because the safety of the public is the first duty of government, and there are few jobs more fundamental to the functioning of our society than the jobs which the people in this room do. And that is why I would like to start by saying thank you. Firstly, thank you to our 43 police and crime commissioners, and congratulations on your elections last May. I can honestly say, following recent painful experience of elections, that I fully appreciate how difficult elections can sometimes be. Police and crime commissioners play a vital role in providing systems leadership, in policing and beyond, setting strategic priorities, acting as the voice of the public, and of course holding policing to account for delivery. So thank you, Donna Jones, for your past year as APCC chair, and congratulations, Emily, on your recent appointment. I look forward to working with you. And thank you also to Gavin, who I can see here, and your team at the NPCC. And thank you to the operational police leaders here with us for your dedication and commitment. But I think most importantly of all, thank you to the 150,000 officers under your command for the work they do every day to keep us safe. Whenever an officer puts on the uniform or says goodbye to their family to go to work, they put themselves at risk in a way few other professions do. So I would like to particularly thank each and every police officer for the dedication and sacrifice which they make on behalf of the rest of us. We are grateful. I am deeply conscious of the officers who have made the ultimate sacrifice by giving their lives in the line of duty. And during my time as police minister, I met many bereaved families. And in my own borough, Croydon, in South London, I recently attended the unveiling of a memorial for Sergeant Matt Ratana, who was killed in the line of duty by a suspect who had been detained at the Windmill Road Custody Centre, a tragedy which touched our whole community in Croydon. This reminds us of the sacrifices made every day, and it's therefore right that a few months ago we were able to announce the new Elizabeth emblem, recognising police officers and other public servants who lost their lives in the line of duty. And it's fitting that among the very first recipients of that emblem, just a week or two ago, were the families of police constables Fiona Bone, Nicola Hughes and Andrew Harper. I know we will never forget their sacrifice. Now, given everything I just said, it is vital that the public and politicians back the police when you act to protect us and to catch criminals. The police often have to use force to detain suspects, conduct stop and searches, engage in high-speed pursuit, use tactical contact, and occasionally discharge a firearm. I believe it is strongly in the public interest to ensure that the police officers on the ground have the confidence to always act decisively when needed, of course within the law and in line with training. Now, I was concerned as police minister, and I'm still concerned today, that we are not getting the balance right. Many officers I've spoken to, whether it's firearms officers at the Gravesend Centre for the Met, through to frontline officers up and down the country, feel that their reasonable use of force or other police powers is treated disproportionately or unreasonably after the event in a way that doesn't reflect or recognise the pressures of dealing with an incident or the split-second decision-making which is inevitably required. And some incidents go into lengthy and bureaucratic IOPC investigations or even prosecutions where common sense says that is not appropriate. And that doesn't serve the public interest because it means police officers on the front line may hold back from taking the action they need to take to catch criminals and keep the public safe. Now, I'm sure Sergeant Martin Blake will be in our minds now. A criminal prosecution hung over Sergeant Blake for 2 years following the shooting of violent gang member Chris Cabba, who at the time was attempting to ram police officers with his car. Having heard all the evidence, a jury acquitted Sergeant Blake in less than 3 hours. And as a South London MP, I'm also very mindful of the case, another illustrative case, PC Paul Fisher. In February 2020, he was driving an unmarked police car to the scene of a frenzied knife attack on Streatham High Road, being committed by recently released convicted terrorist Sudesh Aman. Rushing to the scene, as you would expect, PC Fisher crashed, causing minor injuries to a third party. But absurdly, he was prosecuted for dangerous driving. Now, a jury acquitted PC Fisher, as you would expect, and he was exonerated by the IOPC. But that process took nearly 4 years. And that, I think, is deeply unfair and deeply unreasonable. We need police officers on the front line to be prepared to take the lawful action necessary to protect themselves and the public. We need them to drive quickly to the scene of an attack by a terrorist to save lives. We need stop and search to be used to take knives off our streets. We need force to be used where necessary to detain suspects. And I'm concerned that officers are losing the confidence to exercise those powers as required to keep the public safe. So that is why, in the previous government, we developed proposals to address the issue, including anonymity for firearms officers who are prosecuted, a higher threshold for IOPC referral to the Crown Prosecution Service, faster and more common sense IOPC investigation processes, and a change to the standard required for a successful defence to misconduct proceedings. Now, the new government, I'm pleased to say, is taking forward much of this work, and the new Home Secretary will have my full support in developing those proposals. I also have confidence that the new Director General of the IOPC, Rachel Watson, who I was closely involved in appointing, understands these issues. I think she understands the problems that I've just described. And I'm confident that under her leadership, the IOPC will take a more proportionate and reasonable approach to these issues. But I urge the government to go further. I believe that it should be a defence to both misconduct proceedings and also a defence to any criminal proceedings if a police officer can show that the way they acted followed materially their training or standard procedures in the way they exercised their powers. And I think that would really help give officers the confidence to use those powers to protect the public. So I call on the government to make that change. I've said that before. But if the government doesn't make those changes, then at the next opportunity, as the Shadow Home Secretary, I will seek to introduce those measures as an amendment to the next piece of legislation that goes through Parliament. And I hope that will assist officers on the front line and the operational police leaders here with us today. Police officers take risks to keep us safe, so we should make sure they are always treated reasonably and fairly in return. Let me now say a word about funding, often a popular topic at events like this. I don't think I've had a single meeting with Mark Rowley in the last 2 years when he hasn't mentioned funding. As Police Minister, I always tried to get as much money as possible to you in the front line. In the current financial year, which we're in now, it's a budget which I set as Police Minister just under a year ago, we saw a £922 million increase in funding compared to the previous year, well above inflation. Now, I understand yesterday the Home Secretary talked about a £500 million increase for next year. Now, you'll have the eagle-eyed amongst you will have noticed that is only half, roughly half, the increase which the last government provided to you for the current financial year. So I'm disappointed, I'm sure you are too, that the funding increase is not as big as the funding for next year, is not as big as the funding increase that you had this year. And I'm sure that in the next couple of months, as the government finalises the police funding settlement, that police and crime commissioners and chief constables will want to join me in asking the Home Secretary to do a bit better. I'm sure she can match what we did last year. Now, in terms of police numbers, we had the most recent police officer number figures came out in July, which related to the March 31st sort of waymarker, and we hit, in terms of headcount, 149,769. That is an increase on the previous year, and it is a record ever number of police officers. For some reason, the new government decided not to trumpet that as loudly as I would have liked, but it is a record ever number and a further increase. It's 3,000 more than the previous peak in 2010. So I hope the new Home Secretary will commit to, at the very least, providing funding to maintain those record officer numbers, and I hope even grow them. Now, I know the new Home Secretary has some plans to make changes to neighbourhood policing, but I hope that is not done simply by compelling forces to transfer officers from other important duties, such as response or investigations, or by imposing targets with no funding, because otherwise her changes may backfire. And I'm sure police and crime commissioners, chief constables and I will be watching very closely to make sure those changes are not imposed in a way that is unreasonable. Now, I know that many forces and many PCCs also want to see the funding formula updated, a regular topic of conversation. It's been many years, of course, since that last happened, and there are a number of forces who are being very unfairly treated. Forces like Lincolnshire, Essex and Dorset, for example, have particularly unfair funding settlements. Now, I know, because I've seen it, that all of the preparatory work in the Home Office for a new funding formula has been done. It is sitting on a shelf, or probably on a hard drive, waiting to go. So I urge the new government to get on and bring that forward, as we had intended to, with, of course, protective transitional arrangements to make sure no one loses out as the transition is made. But regardless of funding and police officer numbers, it's vital that we use officers' time effectively to protect the public and catch criminals, and not spend it on other extraneous activities. So I hope that Right Care, Right Person is continuing to be rolled out to ensure that mental health work, where there is no criminality and no threat to public safety, is done by the NHS and not by the police. I hope the work to automate redaction and ideally eliminate redaction in relation to cases that are not going to be charged by the CPS is continuing. And I very much hope, Gavin, that you and the NPCC are continuing to work with Stephen Parkinson, the Director of Public Prosecutions, to make DG6 more reasonable. I have to confess, in all honesty, I tried quite hard during my 2 years to get that sorted out with Max Hill, the previous DPP, and Stephen as well. And if I'm honest, I did not have any success in getting that sorted out. So that was one of the things I wasn't able to do. But I hope, Gavin, that you and your colleagues and PCCs can have more success in the coming year than I managed to have in the last one. If we can get that made more reasonable and more proportionate, it would save a huge amount of police officer time. Now, I also listened to the speeches yesterday about the plans for the creation of new national policing bodies, the reform programme, and moving some national capabilities from one home to another, and, as I understand it, emerging proposals to move money and responsibilities from local police forces to a potential new national body. Now, of course, I'll study those plans carefully when they're brought forward, and they'll no doubt be debated inside and outside Parliament. Now, there are undoubtedly some things that can be better done nationally and require better coordination, the National Police Air Service being an obvious example of that. But I would also just offer a word of caution, just an urge to be careful and thoughtful about this, and to be thoughtful before creating new bureaucracies, because national bureaucracies do not always work well. I mean, the NHS, for example, probably doesn't work as effectively as we would like it to, and that is essentially a national bureaucracy. And we should also be mindful that organisational changes cause certain extra cost, inevitably, as they're created. They certainly create distraction from core work, but don't always deliver the benefits expected. And I wouldn't want to see locally accountable police and crime commissioners or chief constables emasculated or having their funding unreasonably cut. So I think it's just worth being quite thoughtful and quite careful about how proposals are constructed, and I'll certainly scrutinise them in Parliament and outside with those thoughts in mind, because I do think, for many things, the local policing model, 43 forces with their chief constables and police and crime commissioners, are important, and I don't want to see them undermined. Now, I'd like to say a word about trust and confidence in policing. I know that the police operate in an increasingly difficult and fraught environment amidst community tensions and the swirl of merciless and often inaccurate media and social media commentary. So I know it's a very difficult environment to work in. It's a really tough job, and that has been very apparent with the debate in recent days. So it's vital the police command the respect and confidence of the public, because without that respect and confidence, it's impossible for you to do your jobs keeping our communities safe. Policing is only possible with consent. And I believe there is some more work to do in order to ensure that this is unequivocally the case. I mean, firstly, as we discussed, I think, last year, where misconduct arises, it must be swiftly dealt with. Chief officers need more power to act quickly and decisively instead of getting tied up in convoluted and bureaucratic processes involving legally qualified chairs to dismiss officers who do not meet the required standards. And I know changes are in process to do exactly that. Secondly, and most importantly, to command trust and confidence, it's vital the police concentrate on what really matters to the public. Now, it's very welcome that overall crime has in fact fallen substantially and has been for some years. We don't really say that enough. When you talk to the public in public meetings, they often say, oh, you know, crime's going up, it's out of control. But when you look at, and that's partly fueled by social media, it's partly fueled by the way the mainstream media report on crime, only ever focusing on the bad news. But in fact, the overall crime levels, including fraud, according to the Crime Survey of England and Wales, which according to the ONS is the most reliable source of long-term crime trends, over the last 7 years, total crime has fallen by 18%. And homicides today are lower, thankfully, than they were 15 years ago. I think last year it was 590, 15 years ago it was 620. So despite a rising population, there are fewer homicides now than there were. And I think that is something we need to do a better job at communicating to the public. Because when I say that to my constituents in Croydon, they sometimes don't believe me. They say, oh, crime's going up. But it's not. It's actually going down overall. But the public, I think, want more than just falling crime. They want to see crimes solved. Because to a victim, there is no such thing as a minor crime. A phone stolen, a car broken into, a home violated by burglary, a shopkeeper's livelihood ruined by organised or persistent shoplifting. For those victims, these are all serious crimes. And just as with the most serious offences, the public expects action. And most fundamentally, the public expects the criminal perpetrators of these crimes to be caught and prosecuted. And the truth is that not enough crimes are currently being solved. If there's one thing I think we should collectively focus on, it's getting that figure higher. So whether it's shoplifting or whether it's rape and serious sexual assault, I think we need to collectively do a lot better. Last year, only around 8% of reported crimes were solved, and 8% is simply not enough. It means that 92% of reported crimes weren't solved. So to build public trust and confidence, that number needs to be a lot higher. Now, the commitment that policing made last year via the NPCC, and thank you again, Gavin, for that the police would always, not sometimes, but always, follow all reasonable lines of inquiry, must be delivered in practice. And I'm glad that the Inspectorate, under Andy Cook's leadership, is going to be inspecting on that basis. Following all lines of reasonable inquiry, not sometimes, but always. And if we can get those detection rates rising, confidence and trust in policing will invariably rise with them. That is what the public expects. And anything that distracts from that mission, I think, should be jettisoned. Which brings me to the topic of the week, non-crime hate incidents. Now, in my view, the police should be concentrating on investigating and preventing crime. And where speech or actions don't meet the criminal threshold, in my view, it should only attract the attention and time of the police where criminality is likely to imminently follow. That is quite a high bar, and in practice, not one that is currently always being followed. Offensive speech is not the same as illegal speech. The police are not here to police thought. You're not the thought police. Non-crime hate investigations should not trespass upon free speech. They should not be directed at 9-year-old children involved in playground spats, as reported in the Times last week, or at journalists discussing trans issues, such as Julie Bindel. So I think the non-crime hate incident guidance should be rewritten and updated urgently to ensure that only where there is a real risk of imminent criminality, the police should get involved. Now, that is currently the threshold for recording personal data. That was set out in revised guidance published in a statutory code by the Home Office in June of last year and reflected in APP. But I think that high threshold should apply not just to the recording of personal data, but also to whether the police spend time looking at an incident at all in the first place. So I call on the government today to urgently ensure the guidance is updated, using legislation if needed. And I call on police forces to apply common sense and not waste time and resources looking at things unless there is criminality or unless there is an imminent risk of criminality. I think that will help rebuild confidence in policing and it will free up time to spend on crime. Now, the final topic I'd like to touch on is one that Katie referenced in her very kind introduction, which is a topic people won't be surprised by. It's technology. Because I believe passionately, as I hope everybody here does now, that the use of technology has the potential to revolutionise policing and crime detection in very profound ways. We've seen it in the past. We saw almost exactly 120 years ago the first conviction secured using fingerprint evidence. 35 years ago, we saw the first conviction secured using DNA evidence, which I think was the case of Colin Pitchfork in 1988 or 1989. Now, there are new technologies now that I think will have a similarly profound impact to those two technologies of the past. Now, when I left the Home Office a few months ago, I had allocated around £80 million to be spent in this current financial year on technological innovation. That is far more than had ever been allocated before to innovation. Most Home Office tech spending is on things like communication systems, replacing and updating the PND or PNC, those kind of legacy projects. This £80 million was all for brand new projects. Now, I very much hope that Rachel Reeves, the new Chancellor, when she's not busy rewriting her CV, has not snaffled any of that £80 million. I've been asking the Home Office to confirm that the money is still there, and I haven't had a completely straight answer, if I'm honest. But the money was there 4 months ago, and I hope it still is. And that money was intended, as I say, to develop new technology. And that included the use of artificial intelligence, which is already making operations, data analysis, and communications more efficient, and has vast potential to go further, not just in making police operations more efficient, but also in analysing large data sets to identify crime patterns and even sifting through large data sets to identify specific criminals. So AI has enormous potential. I think autonomous drones operating beyond the visual line of sight has the potential to act as a first responder, to get to a scene quickly and get video footage of something, and also gather intelligence. Various American police forces, including the NYPD and the LAPD, are already using autonomous drones. That means they fly themselves. You give them the target and they just fly there themselves without needing an operator. They are already using that to get to a scene quickly and get live video feeds of crimes that are being committed or essentially tracing perpetrators as they flee. And that can now be done on an autonomous basis. Knife scanning technology is something I was also funding previously, and I hope is being carried on. So there are emerging technologies that enable officers, particularly in urban forces, to scan the public walking down a high street to see if they're carrying a knife. The technology appears to be able to distinguish between a mobile phone or a bunch of keys versus an actual knife. And that means that if you can scan hundreds of people, identify the one or two that are carrying a knife, and then do a physical stop and search, it means those stop and searches can be done with precision, rather than having to search a lot of people with the associated issues that creates. So I'm really hoping that technology, assuming that my successor is still investing in it, will be ready to trial on the streets in the early part of next year. And in places like Croydon and other urban centres, that could be revolutionary in getting knives off of our streets. And then, of course, live and retrospective facial recognition. I hope every force is getting every single video image they can from crime scenes and running it through the PND for a retrospective facial recognition match. I think we were targeting 200,000 searches this year. I really hope the Home Office are continuing to monitor that to make sure that is being used not just for some offences, but for every offence where you've got an image of the perpetrator. But I think live facial recognition, as I've said before, has enormous potential. It's been tried quite a lot in Croydon Town Centre over recent months. I got an update just a couple of days ago, and in just a few months, using live facial recognition on a sporadic basis, just once a week or something like that, it's led to over 120 arrests of criminals who would not otherwise have been caught. You know, matching people just walking by the camera against a watch list, which in the case of the Met is about 16,000 wanted criminals. One of the people that walked past the camera and was pulled over and arrested had been wanted for 14 years, but hadn't been arrested. There was another man who had been wanted for a double rape dating back to 2017, who walked past the camera, was identified, and then arrested. People wanted for Class A drug supply, GBH, burglary, fraud, and a surprising number of people who had failed to attend court or who had breached their registered sex offender conditions were also arrested. That is 120 arrests of people just in one town centre who would not otherwise have been caught thanks to live facial recognition. And as a result of that, I was told by Croydon Police yesterday that in the town centre where this has been used, violence with injury is down by 12% and street robbery is down by 19%. The local police think, because criminals know it's being used and therefore avoid coming to the town centre. The local superintendent who's running this, Mitch Carr, rightly describes the technology as game-changing. So I'd like to thank Chief Constable Jeremy Vaughan of South Wales, if he's here, and the Met's Intelligence Director, Lindsay Chiswick, who are the NPCC leads for this, for the work they've done, as well as Superintendent Mitch Carr for the work he's done on the ground in Croydon. I know some forces are using live facial recognition already. Essex, I know, have been using it, for example, along with South Wales and others. But if you're not using live facial recognition to catch criminals who would not otherwise get caught, this is scanning people walking down a street to match them against the wanted list, I strongly encourage you to give it a try. Lindsay Chiswick at the Met can advise on the practicalities. If you ask nicely, she might even lend you one of her vans that has the camera equipment attached to it. There is very good College of Policing authorised professional practice explaining how the technology can be used lawfully and proportionately to make sure that it respects privacy and the various legal safeguards. So providing the APP is followed, this is really effective technology that, if you use it, will enable you to catch criminals who would not otherwise be caught. So I just strongly encourage the adoption of that technology. So let me just finish by saying this. I think you all in the policing family collectively do a vital job. The functioning of our society, of our economy, and in fact of our entire civilization depends on the work you do to fight crime and to maintain order. I know there are serious challenges that we face. Tensions in our society these days are often spilling onto our streets. Social media makes public discourse less civil. Crime is becoming more complex and technology is moving fast. But I know that policing in this country will continue to rise to meet these challenges as it always has. And while I may on occasion have some constructive comments on the issues of the day and perhaps the odd word of criticism for the government, I'd like you to know that I want you to succeed in your mission. And as Shadow Home Secretary, I will do everything I can to ensure that you do succeed. Thank you.
Hello, come take a seat, Shadow Home Secretary. You're getting used to that new moniker.
Just about. Although I was on Sky with Kay Burley this morning, who referred to me in my previous job. So we are still getting used to it.
Still getting used to it, and I know that people in the room will be as well. And I remember us talking this time last year. A couple of the questions coming in on the app here, which I'll come to in a moment. I mean, we have to acknowledge, as your new leader has done, that there are presumably multiple lessons that you all wish to learn from your time in government. There was a seismic drop-off in confidence in the Conservatives in terms of dealing with crime and policing, criminal justice system in crisis, tiny proportion of crimes being solved, which you alluded to. The Police Superintendents Association chief, Nick Smart, I mean, you talked about funding. He said there are not enough police officers to deal with the demand we face. There has been a chronic underinvestment in policing 4 years, and the service has been financially drowning for more than a decade. Will you just face those head on and tell us what lessons that you've learned and what you regret most?
Well, I think that the main challenge is the one that I talked about. 92% of reported crimes are not solved, and that figure is too high, right? So the most basic and fundamental challenge is to just solve more crimes, and that will have a deterrent effect on criminals. If they know they've got a higher chance of being caught, they're less likely to.
Yeah, but that's looking forward. I'm saying, what are your biggest regrets?
Well, I think that is one of that is something anyone who's been involved in policing, including in government, in the last few years, should acknowledge and confront. And I think getting that figure higher, and it has been going up a bit in the last 2 years, I would add, but that trend needs to accelerate, and we need to do more in that area. On the point about numbers and resourcing, I mean, I touched on this in my remarks as well, and we do now have record ever police numbers, headcount of very nearly 150,000. And the funding increase that I organised as police minister about this time last year was nearly £1 billion extra for frontline policing. So I think
a lot of that was to restore what had happened under the austerity programme. It was an uplift programme making up for the numbers that have been lost.
So on the officer numbers, so they did go down in the years after 2010, that is true. But in the recent recruitment drive, we more than recovered that. So the previous peak was in 2010. It was about 146,000 by head count, and we've now got just under 150,000. So we're about 3,000 higher than the previous peak, which was in 2010. But I think it's important to make sure that the officers are being deployed in the areas that make a difference. So that's why, taking officers away from dealing with mental health work where there's no criminality and no threat to public safety is important. I mean, I spoke to frontline response officers who were sometimes picking somebody up and spending 13 hours waiting in an A&E to hand over a Section 136 patient. I've talked about the use of technology. So there are officers who spend hours and hours redacting case files before handing them over to the CPS. So, for example, I think that redaction should happen after the charging decision because a third of cases are not charged, and we should use artificial intelligence to do that. We could save hundreds of thousands of hours of police time each year by making changes like that. So it's not just about asking for more resources, important though that is, it's also about asking ourselves in policing, or yourselves, challenging questions about making sure we're using those resources as efficiently and effectively as possible. And things like live facial recognition are a good example of that. The yield on relatively small numbers of officers in terms of hours spent has led to 120 arrests that wouldn't otherwise be made. That is a massive return on investment.
Okay, Nick Adams, and this is a question that's got a lot of likes on this system. It's very useful.
Okay.
Why did your government then not address the funding formula reform during your time in office? To go back to that question about funding, he said that report on the shelf must have had a lot of dust on it.
Yeah, well, that is a fair point. So it's been many years since the funding formula has been updated. And if you're asking, what could we have done, in the last year or two, that is one thing that I would have liked to have brought forward. There were various complications to do with the Treasury that delayed it. But what I did make sure, as Police Minister, was the work has been done. Right, it was completed a few months ago, and I guess the early election got in the way a bit as well. But it is long overdue.
It's just too late.
It is long overdue. But I have made sure the work's been done. So if the new government want to, it is there and it's ready to go straight away.
Okay, to just touch on the comments that you made about the non-crime hate incidents. This was a code that you originally brought in. Do you just wish you'd never brought that code in?
Well, no, to be clear, the origins of non-crime hate incidents...
Or the guidelines last year.
Well, hang on, let me just explain. So the origins of non-crime hate incidents go back to the aftermath of the awful Stephen Lawrence murder in 1993 and the subsequent report published in 1999, and then some ACPO guidance which came out, I think, in about 2000 or 2001. So non-crime hate incidents as a concept go back 25 years, and they originate in ACPO guidance, not in legislation. Now, the government didn't get involved until the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act 2022, and in particular, sections 60 and 61 of that act provide a power to you to produce a statutory code of conduct regulating the recording of personal data. And we then did lay a code of conduct. It was in June of last year, which basically really severely restricted the sort of circumstances under which personal data, like a name and an address, could be recorded. That followed a court case. But what I'd like to now see, so NCHIs were not created by government.
No, but the guidelines were last year.
The guidelines were restricting the use of NCHI personal data. I would like to now go further and actually apply those restrictions to the investigation of NCHIs in general.
But in the process of you saying very specifically there, how do police assess where there is imminent risk, then actually they still have to engage with these incidents. They have to still work out whether there is an imminent risk of criminality. I mean, that's a bit of a fudge, isn't it? There were quite clear lines in that code that you put through last year, talking about debate, humour and satire, not grounds for recording it. Shouldn't be recorded if the report is deemed by the police to be trivial. It's all there, isn't it? This is politics.
So hang on a sec. No, because those guidelines relate to recording personal data. They don't relate to the investigation that may take place. Now, I'm saying not only should personal data not be recorded in those circumstances, nor should any investigation take place at all. Now, you can make a very quick judgment based on the initial report of the alleged incident, whether it's a tweet or a report that somebody makes, whether or not the threshold that I specified is met. And if it's not met, then it shouldn't even be looked into.
Okay. Donna Jones, name very familiar to you. If you were Home Secretary, how would you reform policing? You said you're going to look very carefully at the proposals from Yvette Cooper yesterday. Yeah.
Well, I think I would like to see... So there are some national capabilities, like NPAS, which I mentioned, that are best done on a proper national basis. So that sort of thing I would certainly support. But I think it's very easy to get sort of distracted by changing structures. It happens sometimes in government where you sort of think reorganising a department will somehow create a big change. You get it in businesses as well, where people think like merging businesses is going to release efficiencies or do things better. The data suggests that most government reorganisations actually don't release the benefits expected. Something like 70% of corporate mergers don't end up delivering the benefits. So I'm just saying be a bit cautious about assuming this is a golden bullet. There are some areas that probably would benefit from national consolidation, but just be a little bit careful. What I would like to see is just a relentless, day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month focus on the basics, which is solving more crime, making sure police are in the right place, using technology to become more efficient, using technology to catch more criminals. Let's just let's make sure those basics don't get forgotten, because that is what the public want to see.
Give me a wave if you want to ask a question from the floor. I'm just going to scan the room quickly. I think most people are submitting them through the app, but I'll keep a close eye on that. Just talk to you a little bit about confidence in policing. This time last year, the Home Secretary had just been sacked after that extraordinary row where she had questioned the police's impartiality in policing the protest. She ordered a review, which is worth touching on. Because the review that was carried out by the head of the inspectorate, Andy Cook, said senior officers had reported improper pressure or interference from significant political figures. The review she commissioned found overt attempts to influence operational policing and challenging the police's impartiality could reduce public trust. Do you accept that public trust in policing was undermined by a Conservative Home Secretary in that incident?
Well, you're going back into history now, and obviously
Well, it's quite recent history. It was exactly this time last year.
It was, I remember that. And
Do you think she jeopardised confidence in policing?
Look, I think, to talk about the issue more generally, I think it is legitimate for elected politicians to comment on, to hold policing to account and to comment on policing issues, because, while, of course, respecting operational independence. And actually,
this was more than questioning, wasn't it?
Well, look, I mean, obviously, those aren't words. The words that she used are not words that I chose to use at the time and wouldn't and haven't subsequently and wouldn't in the future. But I think it is reasonable for politicians to raise questions that are of public concern, because essentially elected politicians, whether members of parliament, whether police and crime commissioners, even local councillors and certainly government ministers, are essentially the conduit through which the public's opinion gets transmitted to policing and indeed other parts of the public sector. So I wouldn't want to sort of say that politicians
do you regret
can't
that?
comment.
Do you regret that realm? You must do.
Well, look, I mean,
try to reset that relationship.
Look, I'm always, well, look, I think I can only speak for myself. I always tried to have, and I hope I did have, always a constructive relationship with policing leaders, and I'd like to continue that in the future.
Okay, anybody waving at me? Otherwise, I'll go to Slido. Joe Coles, you've mentioned both hate crime and facial recognition technology, and indeed the new policing minister gave you credit for your engagement in that area yesterday when she said. Can you set out where you see the balance of civil liberties in these areas?
Well, thinking about live facial recognition, there is existing case law. It's the Bridges case from 2020 in the Court of Appeal, which sort of sets out the kind of guide rails around the use of live facial recognition. So that includes things like having public signage where it's being used so the public know that live facial recognition is in process. It includes making sure there is no racial bias, which was a problem in the early days. And testing by the National Physical Laboratory has demonstrated there is no racial bias at the setting that the police use the system at. Got to make sure that it's sufficiently accurate, and the current system does comfortably exceed the accuracy levels set out by the court. It is actually astonishingly accurate. I think it's running at about 1 in 6,000. So for every 6,000 people scanned, 5,999 are accurately identified. There is only one false positive. And I think in the Croydon deployments, the only false positive was the twin brother of the person that was wanted. So I think there are those, and critically, if somebody walks past the camera who is not on the wanted list, which presumably would apply to everybody here, the image is immediately and automatically deleted. So that's all set out in the case law, it's set out in the authorised professional practice. Now, it may be that the government wants to put that on more of a statutory footing in order to make sure there is proper parliamentary scrutiny and public debate. One thing I had in mind to do in the late spring, early summer, but wasn't able to because the election was called unexpectedly, and as it turns out, foolishly early.
Foolishly early now, that's
foolishly early, yes,
okay.
there we are. You don't need to be an electoral genius to conclude that calling the early election is not a great idea. But I had in mind, to publish a sort of small white paper or consultation document going over these issues to facilitate a public and a parliamentary debate. So the new government may want to do that, and I would obviously support it if they did. But the guidelines are all there. And what I found, particularly in the Croydon deployments, I've done quite a few public meetings where I've essentially, together with the local police, explained what's been going on in Croydon Town Centre. And by and large, the majority of the public, I would say 80 or 90%, say, look, I'm prepared to be scanned as I walk down the high street or walk past the station, knowing that my image will be immediately and automatically deleted if I'm not on the watch list. I'm quite happy for that to happen if, as a consequence, hundreds of criminals who would not otherwise be caught get taken off the street. That is a sort of trade-off the public, certainly in Croydon and I think more widely, are willing to make. But we do need to, I think, communicate that properly. There are some voices sort of on the libertarian sort of fringe, and some people who are sort of at the other end of the spectrum who raise concerns about this, but they are not the majority. By any means, they're a small minority, but we should make sure that those voices don't disproportionately push the debate, because the vast majority of the public, I think, when I've explained it to them, think it's a good idea.
Okay, I think we're out of time. You've taken a lot of different questions from different incoming angles, so we're very grateful for that, Shadow Home Secretary. We're grateful that the socks made another appearance, as Katie mentioned, and thank you on behalf of the room here, who will have been listening very intently to what you've had to say this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. Good to see you. Thanks, Julie. Have a good day.